and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. With so much going on in terms of Trump's tariffs, Putin's refusal to abide by ceasefire deals, China's alleged support of Russia's war in Ukraine, India and Pakistan, nuclear-armed neighbours on the verge of war, and the upcoming BRICS summit, today's world is indeed unpredictable and frightening. How do we see these situations playing out, and what are the geopolitical possibilities we might have to face going forward? Well, to unpack all of this is Marcin Przychodniak. He's an analyst at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Welcome, Marcin, to TVP World.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thanks for taking the time. Right, so let's start with the relationship between China and Russia. How would you characterize it at the moment?
Well, to say it very formally, it is a strategic partnership in a way that both countries share the same interests, but in different regions. But they do cooperate because they believe that the cooperation is in their strategic objective, which is simplifying right now, I'm simplifying, which is to change the international order in a way they find better for themselves, for their policies, for their situation.
Okay, tell us more about the international order, because that will, okay, just let's start with that. What changes to the international order are they seeking?
Well, simply speaking, it's to overthrow or make the position of the US smaller in comparison to their own, which is both countries, China specifically, believes that it is their time's coming, right? The economic potential, the ideology they present, that all means that this is the times of China are coming, and the only blockade or the barrier to China becoming the most important superpower of a country with where its interests are possible to be delivered more equal, better in a better way, it's the US. So they need to somehow make the position of the US smaller, and the rivalry of the US is their most important objective right now. Russia plays here a helpful hand for China in accomplishing these objectives.
Right. Okay. You mentioned the United States, specifically President Trump, of course, at the moment, who's slapped these tariffs onto China. The representatives of both governments are meeting in Switzerland, I believe, tomorrow. So, how would you characterize the importance or the opportunity for the US to stop China's global ambition?
Well, US still has the capabilities and still has the upper hand in many sectors, mostly economic, mostly technology, also a little bit still military potential, where it is better in comparison to China in terms of its rivalry with China. But the process is ongoing, and this is currently, and I believe President Trump and the US, also under President Biden, but President Trump specifically, sees that the dynamics here and would like to stop the process and turn it over. I mean, to make the U.S. potential better in comparison to China. And I believe that the tariffs are one of the instruments that are designed to make this situation, this scenario, successful.
Okay, now you mentioned China and Russia being strategic partners. At the same time, China and the European Union has a, how should I put it, indeterminate relationship. On the one hand, the EU is sanctioning Russia in so many ways, and on the other hand, China wants a good relationship with the EU because it sees it as a very large market, which of course it is. How is that balance managed by China and the EU?
Well, I think China is quite convinced right now that EU does not have many options on the table, considering the differences between the EU and the US right now under Trump, the quite challenging transatlantic relationship, the reduction of trust between the partners. So that makes China believe that they don't really have to deliver much for the European Union to convince maybe not the institutions, not the European Commission, which has quite a strong and very open attitude towards China, describing it more as a rival or a threat rather than the opportunity. But China would like to, and is still addressing the member states. And there are certain member states that would like to use it out of different because of different reasons, would like to use this opportunity as in their own policies, out of mostly economic reasons, but sometimes also political, like Hungary, for example. So the China's tactics right now is rather to wait and see, because they believe that the time plays into their benefit right now. I mean, you will have no other opportunity to come to China and at least try to strengthen the relationship, which has been deteriorating since a couple of years because of, economic problems, but also China relationship with Russia. So what China do is simply repeating the message, but rather not providing the EU with a specific offer in terms of these problems I mentioned.
So do you anticipate that relationship becoming stronger or weaker going forward? I mean, clearly China is seen as a threat by some EU countries. Do you see that message becoming stronger as we go forward?
I think yes. I think so. I mean, all the differences between member states are, of course, fair and will not be easily, downgraded and cannot be easily solved. So what I see from the approach of the EU institutions and the European Commission and the European Council, that it's to tactically manage these challenges, to come up with a tactical approach to China with certain conditions that, simply saying that yes, we can do more together, but there are conditions that you have to meet first in order, if you expect us to deliver something else. I mean, and these conditions are simply economic, of course. The whole issue of subsidies by the Chinese and the inequities, not equal conditions for the European companies, but also different tactics on the European market. So EU will, especially the Commission, will use all the instruments it has on the common market and in trade issues, but also versus this aspect, security aspect, which is of course quite problematic because of differences of competences between, the Commission does not really have a lot of competences in terms of security. This is a matter of all the member states, but still, China relationship with Russia is still being presented by the Commission as something which needs to be changed somehow by the Chinese. And you mentioned sanctions. There are, of course, Chinese companies or entities sanctioned by the EU because of their cooperation with Russia. This is mainly symbolic. These are, I don't know, no more than 10 people or companies that are on the list, but still symbolic plays here an important part. And I think in another packages of sanctions on Russia being right now negotiated by the EU, the China element will still be there.
President Xi Jinping is attending VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, today actually, isn't it, in Moscow. What message is that sending to the European Union and the rest of the world?
Well, I mean, it's just repetition of the strategic importance of Russia for China. I mean, that he went there, this is a visit which started yesterday and will be, he left China yesterday, visit started today, but he will be there until 10th of May. And so it's quite a long visit. It's not usually Chinese chairman comes to other countries.
Why does China need Russia?
Days. Why does China need Russia? That's a very good answer. That's a very good question. Because Russia has certain capabilities that can deliver. One is political support, which is, to provide the same ideological narrative towards the West. They do share it. Russian disinformation tactics are shared by the Chinese. The narratives, disinformation narratives, are repeated by the Chinese and Russians together, not only in Europe, but also in other parts of the world and Africa, for example. So that's one, political. Military aspect is also quite important. Chinese are getting, first of all, I mean, the Russian actions, aggression on Ukraine first, and the threat that is originating from Russia towards the EU and NATO in Europe, this is something that plays quite an important part in Chinese plans of keeping the US troops, especially Navy and Air, in Europe, which is of course very much important from the perspective of Chinese plans towards Taiwan, for example, and in South China Sea. So that's one thing militarily, but also the other, Russia has a lot of experiences and possibilities to support China in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, in case when something happens there, when China becomes even more active, either towards Taiwan or in the South China Sea or even towards Japan, Russia can provide certain support militarily for China in that theater. So that's important. And of course, economically, Russia is not a very important economic partner from the perspective of the whole Chinese economy, but it can deliver certain goods which are important from the Chinese perspective. So there are very important reasons why Russia is helpful from the Chinese perspective. Of course, Chinese does not treat Russia as an equal partner. This is not a no-limit partnership. These countries have their differences, and Chinese are trying to present it in a way that they are a senior partner. And if you read Xi Jinping's article in a Russian newspaper, which was published yesterday, this is a quite good example of how Chinese narratives are being printed by the Russian media before the visit, of course. I mean, with a lot of mentioning of, the brotherhood of arms, which both countries had, as the Chinese chairman is saying. I mean, as the article says, which historically is not entirely true, but still, the brotherhood of arms that both countries had in the 40s during the Second World War, and not explicitly, but there is this kind of comparison of how they are cooperating right now, right? The whole narrative about fighting with Nazism, right? About being, which is of course part of the Russian narrative in Ukraine, right? I mean, how they.
Right.
So this is very telling in terms of their cooperation.
In the last few seconds that we have, very quickly, if you would, please, BRICS summit coming up in Rio de Janeiro. One of the items on the agenda, according to Reuters, is global governance reform, which might actually worry many people, having global governance reformed by China and Russia and Iran, actually. Yeah. What does that mean, very briefly?
Well, I don't think it has a specific meaning for the BRICS countries, because this is a platform of communication. There are so many differences there between the countries that it will be very difficult for them to actually establish a common platform on, especially global governance. I mean, I will refer again to Xi Jinping in his article. He mentions very strongly the UN and how China and Russia will cooperate within the UN to make this institution, as he writes, better, but I would probably say as better in terms of their own interests, right? So they gather, China mostly, but with Russia's help and Russia's presence, gather countries which may find
right.
their propositions better from different perspectives in platforms like BRICS, and then make it more successful in the UN, for example.
All right, thank you very much for laying that out for us. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there.
Thank you very much.
That's all that we have for you in this episode of World Talks, but don't go away, lots more coming up. Bye-bye.